Thank you very much. The final item of business is a members' business debate on motion 24199 in the name of Alexander Burnett on further support for autism and learning disabilities. The debate will be concluded without any questions being put. Can I ask those members who wish to speak in the debate, please to press the request to speak buttons now, and I call on Alexander Burnett to open the debate.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Now, like many newly elected MSPs 5 years ago, I was faced with a huge variety of casework, much of which I had no prior knowledge or experience. But it was clear that a lot involved a lack of access to services and support for those in the autism and additional support needs community. And speaking to fellow MSPs in Parliament, I found that this was not just a North East issue. And so at this point, can I thank members from across the Chamber for their support in bringing this motion to debate? And can I also thank them, and in particular my co-convener Annie Wells, for their ongoing support for the Autism Cross-Party Group, which we founded in 2017. And for that, special thanks also to the National Autistic Society and Scottish Autism, who has so successfully been the Secretariat since then. So successful, in fact, that it is undoubtedly the best attended CPG that I'm involved with, and the current Zoom format has only allowed more to have joined from across Scotland. We were one of the first, I believe, to take our CPG on the road, so to speak, up to the North East, which allowed participation to many who otherwise would have continued to be excluded. But before I talk about the issues, I would just like to thank those in the community for two particularly important lessons. The first is how personal autism is to each individual. No two people are alike. Learning to listen to them and understanding individual needs leads to understanding their individual potential. The second is that autism is not a learning disability. 30% of people with autism may have learning disabilities, but to conflate the two stigmatizes and hinders both understanding and resolution. And these points then turn into three stumbling blocks. Firstly, diagnosis. People are crying out for diagnosis, and then care and support when they receive that diagnosis. And there is a huge gap in the provision of these services, with people waiting months, and then the battle of getting the support to help them begins, which is then an ongoing struggle for many. Secondly is education. And right now with homeschooling, we have varying feedback. Some have actually flourished, while others have had huge setbacks on their education. And it is not helped by the fact that there is a severe lack of understanding of their needs. And at no fault to our wonderful teaching staff, but they need to be provided the resources and training in order to provide the support. But what has been startling to me is that there are so many children from the community who are not supported in their transition from education into the working world, a scary process for any teenager. And that leads thirdly, employment. Now, those with autism and ASN have found that they fear furlough and redundancy more than others, as they are scared of asking for reasonable adjustment. If they do lose their job, the struggle of having no job and no income can be exponentially more stressful to this community. And the fear of finding a new job that supports them can be crippling. Now, fortunately, there are many organisations who are doing their utmost to work on these issues and more. And I'd like to take this opportunity to thank not only the national bodies, but also those closer to home. So to name a few, I've had the good fortune to be able to visit and work with Ask North East, the Grampian Autistic Society, Grampian Opportunities, and Sensational. They have worked for many years assisting the autism community. I'd like to thank them for giving me a broader understanding of what further support is required in the North East. But the most serious issue for me came through my awareness of those with autism who, instead of receiving understanding and care, were ignored and locked up in mental institutions, causing further deterioration and with no prospect of improvement or release. One of these cases is Kyle Gibbon, of which members across the Chamber will know I have brought much attention to and raised this individual case directly to the Minister. And with, it pains me to say this, disappointing results. Kyle has been locked up in the State Hospital Carstairs for most of his adult life, and remains there to this day. While staff justify keeping him on behavioural grounds, his mother, Tracy, strongly believes his detention is causing problems, not solving them. And allegations of bullying and inappropriate treatment fail to see the light of day. And it is not only Kyle. Ruth Hughes came forward with her story of her son Gordon, and he's been locked up in Carstairs for the past 3 years. His doctor recommended he was moved to a medium secure hospital. However, he was sent to Carstairs instead, as there were no medium secure beds available, and he remains there to this day. But what is so shocking is not just for further allegations of mistreatment that families fail to get answers on, but that the future for these young men in good physical health is a lifetime of incarceration. And I'll repeat that, a lifetime of incarceration, locked up alongside those guilty of heinous crimes simply because the government won't resource their treatment. But all of this leads to potential solutions. And a recent report from a cross-party group proposed a commissioner to safeguard rights and allow accountability for autistic people's rights, those with additional support needs. And I support the next steps of investigation, which should come in the next Parliament. Now, that may well be the required outcome, but that should not prevent other solutions or absolve others of existing responsibilities. Improvements in policy development, improvements in professional practice, consistency across local authorities, and increased budgetary consideration can all be delivered today, and all are within the power of the Scottish Government. This failing of government is not confined to autism, and sadly demonstrates a far greater problem with Holyrood. But one thing is clear though, the autistic community needs a voice, and they need to be part of the solution. The cross-party group was long overdue and has given a voice here in Holyrood, and tonight's debate amplifies that. But we must not stop now. They must not be left behind, and I will continue to do all I can to ensure that we reach a true point of equality for this community. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now call Joan McAlpine to be followed by Jamie Green.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer, and I would like to congratulate Alexander Burnett on securing this debate. As Vice Convener of the Cross-Party Group on Learning Disability, I am delighted to support calls for a Commissioner for Learning Disability and Autism. We have made progress in Scotland with Keys to Life and the Scottish Strategy on Autism, but there is so much more to do, as Alexander Burnett has outlined in some of the shocking examples he's just given with regards to autism. My remarks will be about learning disability. Over the course of the pandemic, I have raised concerns about the higher mortality of learning disabled people. But care workers for learning disabled people received routine testing only this year, and all learning disabled people only got prioritised for the vaccine last week. Hopefully a Commissioner would have pushed for this earlier. Keys to Life acknowledges the poorer health outcomes and the need for reasonable adjustments for people with learning disabilities, but these don't always happen. It also recommends better data to identify people with learning disabilities, and we know now that this is not in place, and it will make it harder to reach this community for the vaccine. The understandable desire to ensure that people with learning disabilities are treated as equal citizens has perhaps created a fear of medicalising them inappropriately, but that ignores their vulnerability, and I hope that lessons can be learned by any future Commissioner. Another issue I have raised that I hope a Commissioner would address is the loss of support services during the pandemic, in particular building-based day services. This is despite the Cabinet Secretary for Health repeatedly stating that health and social care partnerships would be fully reimbursed to provide these services, and also writing to the heads of social work to tell them that day services are important. My own motion on this subject received cross-party support, and I thank all those who signed it, but unfortunately it did not secure debate time. Even when shops, pubs, schools and other services were reopening last summer, adult day services remained closed or severely restricted. Alternatives, including those using self-directed support, were often poor, perhaps a walk for a few hours a week around a shopping centre, colouring in packs, or a chat on an iPad for a couple of hours. Several families have told me that health and social care partnerships were using the pandemic as an excuse to close these services altogether. The father of a young adult who attended the Murray Owen Centre in East Kilbride told me, as did others, how much his daughter was suffering from the disruption to her life caused by the closure of the centre. He said it offered stimulation through a variety of activities, professional support, and perhaps most importantly, a caring community, all snatched away. Her dad told me she wants to be with her friends, but her views are ignored. Glasgow and North Lanarkshire has already closed day services centres, and Inverclyde is currently redesigning them, as is South Lanarkshire. The dad I spoke to believes that these decisions are driven by an ideological antipathy to day services, which ignores the views of those who use them and indeed love the service, although obviously these services are not for everyone, but if we are for personalised care, we need to listen to people. I hope any commissioner appointed will understand that the community of people with learning disability and autism is as varied in its needs as society at large, and all individuals must be listened to, even when some of them want to use services which don't correspond to current fashions. Finally, while I support the creation of a commissioner, I have concerns about demands for the full incorporation of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability into Scots law. This follows my meeting with the Royal College of Psychiatrists and Scotland Learning Disability Lead, who highlighted the unintended consequences of removing the concept of incapacity. This could end guardianship and so remove caring families from decisions affecting their loved ones, resulting in worse health outcomes and putting power into the hands of the very authorities who have presided over poor outcomes for years. The Royal College say this is why the Charter has not been fully adopted by any other jurisdiction in the world, and they are concerned about how consultations around mental health and incapacity here in Scotland have been conducted. So, speaking as someone with direct family experience of learning disability, I very much back the campaign for a commissioner. However, I hope that any future commissioner and indeed the minister will accept that there are real life challenges faced by vulnerable people, and they must come ahead of abstract concepts which could make their lives even more difficult. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And I now call Jamie Green to be followed by Neil Bibby.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer, and good evening to colleagues. I'm afraid I can't see which minister is responding due to the nature of the video, but I look forward to hearing from the government and their response. I can also thank my colleague Alexander Burnett for bringing forward an important debate. I know it's been a busy news day, but this really is our bread and butter, participating remotely or otherwise to raise awareness of issues like this. And like Mr. Burnett, I too received a lot of casework on issues surrounding the subject matter, which I'd like to delve into in my comments this evening. I'd also quite like to start off by reflecting, I think, a wider point, and that's the greater impact of the events of the last year on specifically people with autism and learning difficulties, based on my experiences of helping people through remote casework. Just last week, quite timely, I was contacted by a mother in Ayrshire whose son is a young adult who suffers from developmental disabilities, and he previously attended his local college. And she told me he loves it, or indeed he used to love it. He's been out of college now for the best part of a year and been told not to expect to return until after the summer. That's obviously causing her great concern and him too. She understands why, of course, they're staggering the phased return, but she's frustrated at the lack of any apparent plan to get special needs students back into classrooms and specifically into colleges. Another family got in touch just before Christmas, messaging my office about the deteriorating mental health of their autistic son, who was in a learning disability care home and was not allowed any visitors for obvious reasons from his parents. Neither was he allowed to come home for Christmas. And whilst plans were made to get university students back home for Christmas, no such plans were made for him. We flagged this as an issue before Christmas with the Education Secretary, and it's disappointing to learn afterwards that no such plans were put in place. Likewise, she's still not sure when he will receive his vaccine, although we are, of course, all pleased with the changes in the JCVI's recommendations on that. Anyone who listens to BBC Radio 2 will know and have been developing that story. But I've had many, Presiding Officer, examples of this over the last few months. I've had incidents of people engaged in self-harm, an increase in depression and anxiety, and quite simply because many people simply have been unable to understand the restrictions that they and their family have been asked to follow. Quite simply, their norms have been topsy-turvy. For example, the wearing of face masks or physical and social distancing, no least changes to their everyday routine and that lack of social interaction. These things are difficult enough for us as individuals, but surely have a profound effect on those with learning disabilities and indeed severe autism. It has been an anxious time, but I know we can only imagine how amplified all of this frustration and anxiety will have been on those individuals. I'd like to pay commending research to the National Autistic Society for some good work they've done into the effects of this. We've discovered that 9 in 10 autistic people worried about their mental health over lockdown, and 85% of respondents to their survey said their anxiety levels had got worse. I'm afraid in some instances we've heard of people who've taken their lives during lockdown, unable to cope or indeed see a way forward. These are unbearably tragic situations. But, Presiding Officer, there are still too many gaps in the system, I think, to support this group. The Education Skills Committee took evidence on the Morgan Review into additional support needs provision in Scotland. And I'll quote directly from that review, it is important. It said, fragmented and inconsistent and is not ensuring that all children and young people who need additional support are being supported to flourish and fulfil their potential. And that's the vital point here. They need to be able to flourish and fulfil their potential, because it's estimated now that nearly a third of all pupils have some form of additional support need in school. There's no fix to this, and tweaking the system simply isn't a solution. There needs to be systemic assistance delivered in our schools. The number of ASN teachers has fallen hugely by over 1,000 in the last 10 years. Recruitment is heading in the wrong direction, and I believe that is the perfect storm that I've spoken about many times in this Parliament. I don't have a lot of time left, but I do want to pay mention to that report, because I encourage the Minister to read it. The recommendations therein do establish a number of immediate things that the government, or indeed the next government, could do to better provide for ASN pupils. In summing up, this debate is very short, and it's quite hard to keep track of it with a clock on my screen there, but we do need to have a real think about how we approach ASN provision in this country. This pandemic has highlighted a number of challenges that we already knew about, and it's shed light on many others. Because I think physically disabled young people and those with additional support needs or autism, they deserve the exact same high standard of education, health and life that any other young person in Scotland is entitled to. And I don't think we should accept anything less. Thank you.
Thank you. I now call Neil Bibby to be followed by Mark MacDonald.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. At the outset, can I thank Alexander Burnett for bringing forward this motion, and it's a pleasure to take part in this debate. Like others, I want to commend all those who have come together to campaign for much needed change and to improve the lives of people with autism and people with learning disabilities. In particular, I would pay tribute to unpaid carers for all that they do for their loved ones. They have our thanks and our admiration, and they deserve again to be recognised by this Parliament too. Today's motion is a reminder that for all the progress that has been made, there is still much to do for this Parliament and indeed for the next Parliament that will be elected in May to consider further. A number of these are set out in the motion, including diagnosis and the importance of good post-diagnosis support. I'd also underline the importance of day services, as Joan McAlpine did, in advocacy, particularly as the legislation and welfare rights continue to change and evolve. We all share an ambition to build a more inclusive Scotland, in which all our rights are respected and where nobody is unfairly denied opportunity. And we all have a responsibility to make that ambition, realise those ambitions that we share. Presiding Officer, this week we marked a full year since the COVID pandemic arrived in Scotland. And just like Jamie Green, I am very conscious of the impact the past 12 months has had on autistic people, people with learning disabilities and those closest to them. With the rollout of the vaccine, there is now real hope that the crisis is coming to an end. However, as Joe McAlpine raised, I know there are many people working to support people with learning disabilities right now who have concerns about the way in which the rollout is being progressed. As we know, GCVI prioritisation places people with severe or profound learning disabilities in Group 6. They'll have begun to receive appointments, and the First Minister has indicated others with learning difficulties will be prioritised too, and that is welcome. However, there are vulnerable adults who have learning difficulties who are still currently falling through a disturbing gap in the programme. I know of one provider, Cosgrove Care, who estimated that 50% of people they support in supported accommodation have not yet been offered a vaccine. The Scottish Government quite rightly want to prioritise the most vulnerable. This is a group who are very vulnerable, and yet there are significant challenges in ensuring they receive vaccine. Joe McAlpine mentioned lack of data, different records are held by different surgeries, and many of the people concerned need to be vaccinated at home, not in a central vaccination centre. Providers have rightly commended the work of those on the ground who are delivering the vaccine, and I would too, and the rollout of the vaccine to care homes in particular. They tell me that a consistent approach, vaccination, modelled on the programme in care homes that is coordinated and allows vulnerable people to receive the vaccine in their own home, would make an enormous difference. It would ensure that nobody in supported accommodation falls through the gap. I'd like to ask the Minister to consider whether the rollout is currently addressing the needs of people with learning disabilities, particularly those living in supported accommodation, which I'm sure the Government understands is a unique environment. I know the Scottish Government have received various requests for different groups to be prioritised, and I impress upon the Minister the importance of the rollout vaccine to the most vulnerable people as soon as possible. Presiding Officer, let's get the vaccine to those who need it most. And then as we emerge from this pandemic, let's begin the work of improving the lives of autistic people and people with learning disabilities. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you. I now call Mark MacDonald to be followed by Daniel Johnson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I begin by thanking Alexander Burnett for securing this debate? And can I say that while this is not quite my final speech as an MSP, it is my final speech on this subject. So can I begin by making my final declaration of interest as a parent of a child with autistic spectrum disorder? And I will spend the majority of my speech, I think, offering some reflection on a decade of campaigning on this issue, and why that leads me to support the campaign from NES Scotland, Scottish Autism and Enable for a Commissioner for autistic people and people with learning disabilities. Can I say at the outset, thank you to those organisations for the briefing which they provided, which was both instructive and also chimed with much of the experience of my own caseload, not just during the pandemic, but in general. Alexander Burnett mentioned that autism is not a learning disability, and that is absolutely correct. There is, however, a very clear intersection, which he alluded to, where there are people who have both autism and a comorbid learning disability, and therefore it makes sense for the campaign to focus in the area that it does, because there is a reasonable number of people who have autism and a learning disability, and for whom many of the challenges of both autism and learning disability are manifest. The briefing from NES Scotland and Scottish Autism and Enable talks about the exhaustion of families. And over the last 10 years, if there were one word which would sum up the experience of the families who I've encountered, whether that is constituents or the people who I have come to know as dear friends who have children with a learning disability or with autism who I've encountered through the groups that my son attends, exhaustion would be one of the very top words that I would use. And it's exhaustion because for too many people, the securing of appropriate support to which they are entitled, is a fight. Too often they are told no when they should be told yes. And it is only following a significant amount of energy being expended on fighting decisions, recruiting councillors, MSPs, MPs, organisations in support of them, that they finally are able to secure that support. All too often it feels like the system's first reaction for many is to turn them away, and only when they then take on the system itself do they find that it works in their favour. That's something that has to change. Now, there are many good things being done at a governmental level. I know this from my own time as a minister and as a government backbencher. The problem is how that filters down to those at the front line and how they deliver the support for the people who require it. And that then leads to the question of accountability and why I believe the role of the Commissioner is needed. For too many of the good intentions and the well thought out policies, the accountability for delivery is not there. We saw that with local autism plans when they were introduced, where too many local authorities were given money, but there was no accountability for both the construction of those plans and then the delivery of those plans at a local level. So in terms of the accountability question, the creation of a commissioner as envisaged by the charities would help in that regard. So there is still much that needs to be done. I won't deny there's good work that has been done, but there is still a road to travel, and the implementation of the asks of these charities could do a huge amount to support the people who we as MSPs represent. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. I now call Daniel Johnston, after which we will hear from the Minister.
Deputy Presiding Officer, and can I too thank Alexander Burnett for bringing forward this debate, because it's a hugely important topic and one with which I am intimately concerned. And I should make a declaration both of my own diagnosis with ADHD and the fact that I'm a trustee of the ADHD. I make that declaration because quite simply, I think it's impossible to talk about these issues without discussing intersections with those conditions. And I say that Alexander Burnett is absolutely right in the way he set out the case, making the distinction between autism and learning disabilities and taking us through the issues surrounding diagnosis, education and employment. One of those categories, there are critical issues faced by people with autism, but also how those issues and the assistance that is required just fails to join up for people with autism. Can I also briefly mention Joan McAlpine's contribution? And while I largely want to focus on the role of the Commissioner, I think the point around daycare is one that cannot be made in a number of daycare organisations facing exactly the challenges that she has mentioned. Challenges they faced before the pandemic, but have been deepened by the approach taken since the pandemic. Now, Alexander Burnett mentioned some shocking cases regarding the incarceration of people with autistic spectrum. Let me add some additional shocking prison facts. In the general population, people with ADHD account for around 3 to 5%, but in the prison population, they account for 25%, 5 times the incidence of the general population. Dyslexia, in the general population, one finds an instance of 10%. It's half of all prisoners have dyslexia. And for autism, around 2% of the general population will have autism, but between 4 to 8% of the prison population, the general prison population, are found to have autism, 2 to 4 times the general instance. That is shocking. To have that level, that disproportionate level of people with these conditions in prison, it represents an abject failure of public services and public policies. If this was any other section of society overrepresented in this shocking way, there would be a national outcry. And that is why we need a broad change to the way we approach these conditions and the way we design services to address them. Because right now, there is a silent failure of huge proportions that has occurred for these people with these conditions. Autism and learning disabilities need the focus of a commission is broad and systemic. People with broad bracket of neurodiversity conditions account for 20% of the overall population, but the services they use aren't joined up. They aren't designed for them. As Mark MacDonald just outlined, people have to fight to gain access, and they are being failed. I don't deny that progress has been regards, but all too often they've been confined to the silos of education and health policy. They don't have the joined up thinking. And ultimately, those policies are not designed to help people in their day-to-day lives. They're designed to manage the deficit and the disability rather than helping them with their talents and capability. But overall, there's also a change in attitude. Because all too often, we find that these terms or these conditions are used as terms of abuse? When was the last time you heard someone regard someone's spelling as being a bit dyslexic, or someone who failing to pay attention as being a bit ADHD? Or the last time you heard someone as being on the spectrum because they appeared slightly odd or socially inadequate? The sad reality is that all too often that people use these terms as terms of abuse and do so acceptably without reproach or comment. Attitudes need to change, as well as services and policies. This intolerance is completely unacceptable and must end. And just in closing, I would like to briefly mention the Morgan Review, because it underlined the fight that people have to make, the marginalisation that people experience, and the fact that all too often, while that these issues are acknowledged, that mainstreaming simply means pupils being placed in cupboards to provide their learning, or part-time timetabling for their education. So the need for change has never been more apparent. A commissioner could really be the lightning rod for that change, because people with autism and learning disabilities need change. People with talent, with ability, with contributions to make. And without making these changes, they will simply be denied their ability to take part in society, which they have every right to expect. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now call on Claire Hockey to respond to and wind up the debate.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. And I would like to add my thanks to Alexander Burnett for bringing Enable Scotland, National Autistic Society Scotland and Scottish Autism's campaign for an Autism and Learning Disability Commissioner to the attention of Parliament today. And I'd also like to thank members for their speeches and contributions in what has been a useful debate in raising awareness of autism and learning disabilities. Having recently met with these organisations, it was good to hear more about their campaign, what they foresee the role of the Commissioner to be, and more importantly, how it would make the lives of autistic people and people with a learning disability better. I'm aware that the recommendation for the establishment of a Commissioner was in the Autism Cross-Party Group's report, The Accountability Gap, which was published in October 2020, and I had the pleasure of speaking at the Cross-Party Group in October to update on autism and learning disability policy. As has been mentioned in the debate, the Scottish Strategy for Autism comes to an end this year, also along with the Keys to Life, which these strategies have set out the key priorities for government and public services and how improvements can be made to ensure autistic people and people with learning disabilities can live independent and healthy lives. And these strategies have been informed by people with lived experience. The Scottish Strategy for Autism is currently being independently evaluated, and I look forward to seeing the results of that evaluation in the spring. Going forward and learning from the experiences of the COVID pandemic, the Scottish Government has been working with autistic people and people with learning disabilities, autism and learning disability representative bodies and care providers on a Towards Transformation plan. And the plan, which we are developing in partnership with COSLA, will take a human rights approach and look at the particular needs for Scotland's autistic people and people with learning disabilities. And we see the plan as the beginning of the conversation about how we change Scotland for the better for autistic people and for people with learning disabilities. And I'm pleased that wide stakeholder engagement has taken place with People First and the autistic people's organisations inputting into how the plan is led and governed. It's essential that autistic people and people with learning disabilities are at the centre of how their human rights are protected. This debate demonstrates the wide understanding across the chamber that autistic people and people with learning disabilities face inequalities and prejudices in many aspects of their day-to-day lives. And the Towards Transformation plan will set out a number of priorities we want to deliver to ensure rights are protected and inequalities addressed. Presiding Officer, there have been many positive developments in education policy, an issue that Jamie Green raised in his speech, and many positive developments in the last year. And in December 2020, we published the Autism Action Plan, which sets out actions to improve the support to autistic children in Scotland's school. An implementation group will drive forward this important work, and report to the Deputy First Minister. Angela Morgan's review of additional support for learning, published in 2020, suggested several areas for improvement in how we best support children and young people to flourish. And the report sets out a clear direction, and the Scottish Government and COSLA have developed a joint action plan to implement the report's recommendations. We are determined to improve the educational experiences of children and young people with additional support needs, and to make Scotland the best place in the world to grow up. The Chamber will be aware that we debated the independent review of the adult social care in February, and the review gives us the opportunity to improve people's lives, particularly the lives of people with autism and learning disabilities. And whilst it will be for the next Parliament and Government to move forward on the review, we have taken immediate action to secure improvement for people with autism and learning disabilities. And this includes a new Community Living Change Fund of £20 million, which was announced by the Cabinet Secretary for Health and Sport on the 16th of February, and will deliver a redesign of services for people with complex needs, including autism and learning disabilities, and those with enduring mental health problems.
Would the Minister take an intervention?
Of course I will.
Maurice Curry.
Thank you, Minister. Thank you, Presiding Officer. Indeed, I must declare that my wife is an ASN at a primary school in Helensburgh, so I do hear a lot about the work that they do and the fantastic work, I must say, and you know, supporting children with all sorts of difficulties. Can I ask a question? One of the concerning areas I've got is in higher and further education, and there is definitely a gap there, both with the need for more support there and also the retention of support, because there are some decisions being made in higher education and further education where budgets are affected that they might lose those people and not replace them, which is very important. And obviously in this day and age, we need to make sure that our young people are prepared properly for life. And I was interested in Daniel Johnston's comments about prisons and so would the Minister agree with me that we need to address these facts and particularly higher education and prisons in helping people understand the learning support needs of these people concerned and give them a fair chance in life? Minister.
Well, as Minister with responsibility for autism and learning disabilities, I would support any additional support for those communities. The member will be aware that over the course of the pandemic, there has been additional monies provided to higher and further education to support well-being and to support students through what has been a really challenging and difficult time. And I absolutely accept that for members of the learning disability and autism community that this has been even more challenging for those communities. And so we're working very closely with charities and representative bodies to ensure that we do what we can to help support them, and that would include people who are in higher and further education. But thank you very much for your intervention there, Mr Corrie. I'm pleased that work has commenced on discussions having taken place with a wide range of autism and learning disability organisations, and I'm meeting a range of autistic people and people with learning disabilities in the coming weeks in relation to the Scottish Government's working towards a transformation plan. And in that plan, we have committed to exploring further the proposals for a commission or a commissioner to help protect people's rights. If I might turn, Presiding Officer, to some of the points made by some of the members who have participated in the debate. A couple of members raised concerns about the vaccination programme for people with learning disabilities. We're working very closely with NHS boards to ensure that everyone with a learning disability is identified for vaccination. On the 25th of February, the Chief Medical Officer and the Chief Nursing Officer wrote to confirm the role of learning disability nurses in both identifying people with a learning disability and also delivering those vaccinations, including in people's homes where that is more appropriate. At the outset, Mr Burnett raised an issue about two specific cases, and as I'm sure you'll appreciate, Presiding Officer, due to laws governing patient confidentiality, I won't be able to discuss individual patients, but secure units, including the State Hospital, focus on the provision of high quality and person-centred care and treatment. in a safe and secure environment, and all patients at the State Hospital have the right to make an application to the Mental Health Review Tribunal if they wish to appeal against their detention or the level of security that they are being held in. And those safeguards are important and are rightly channelled through the Mental Health Tribunal. If I might finish off, Presiding Officer, I want to hear first-hand the views of the learning disability and autism communities on the proposal for a commissioner, what they would want a commissioner's role to be, and crucially the wider routes that could be investigated to ensure that the human rights of autistic people and people with learning disabilities are upheld and protected. And to that end, also, as well as meeting with various organisations, I'm also arranging a meeting with autistic people and people with learning disabilities to hear from existing commissioners, to hear about their role in improving lives. And again, this is an opportunity for people with lived experience to be part of the conversation on developments which affect them. I'm committed to ensuring that autistic people and people with learning disabilities continue to be at the heart of exploring the introduction of a commissioner. And Presiding Officer, I'd like to close my remarks by thanking members for all of their contributions.
Thank you very much, Minister. That concludes the debate on further support for autism and learning disabilities. I close this meeting.